how do you topple a 60-year-old regime without actually firing a single shot? I mean, there's no Marines storming the beaches, right? No carrier strike groups launching missiles in the middle of the night.
Or right, no paratroopers dropping in.
Exactly. It's just this slow, totally invisible, suffocating web of
Yeah.
expired century-old pier leases, seized oil tankers, grand jury indictments, and just completely severed banking pathways.
It's really the ultimate evolution of modern warfare. We are so conditioned to think of regime change as this kinetic event, like a line crossed on a map or a sudden explosion.
Yeah, like something out of a movie.
Right. But what we are analyzing today is, well, it's a masterclass in hybrid multidimensional pressure. It's warfare waged by accountants, federal prosecutors, and intelligence directors.
This is wild. So welcome to this custom-tailored deep dive. If you're joining us today, you already know that the geopolitical landscape is rarely as simple as a headline makes it seem.
Oh, definitely not.
Our mission today for you is to pull back the curtain on one of the most complex, unprecedented, and frankly just surreal geopolitical pressure cookers of the 21st century. We're talking about the 2026 United States maximum pressure campaign against the Cuban government.
And it's a situation that has been, escalating quietly in the background for years. But as of the summer of 2026, it has reached an absolute boiling point.
A total powder keg.
Yeah. And the sheer scale, like the intricate legal and financial architecture of the apparatus being deployed against Havana right now, it is staggering.
It really is. So, to map this out for you, we are synthesizing a massive stack of intelligence and reporting. We've got breaking AP news briefs from May 14th, 2026. We're pulling from incredibly dense geopolitical analyses from the O'Connell Royal Institute.
Plus those deep dive legal articles breaking down the highly controversial Helms-Burton Act.
Right, and historical accounts from the Florida Straits and official, freshly unsealed Department of Justice press releases. But look, before we get into the weeds here, because we are diving into decades of highly charged U.S.-Cuba history today, we really need to set some parameters right up front.
Absolutely. Our goal here isn't to take a political stance at all.
Not at all.
We're not here to endorse any specific policy, ideology, or political figure, whether that's left, right, American, or Cuban. We're just looking at the facts.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting on this. We're just here to unpack the mechanics of this strategy based entirely on the intelligence and reports in front of us. We are looking at the blueprints of this pressure campaign to understand how it was built, how it functions, and what it's designed to achieve.
So let's just get right into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
To understand the architecture of this 2026 strategy, we actually have to begin by rewinding the clock 30 years. We have to look at the legal trigger that the U.S. Department of Justice just pulled.
The match in the powder keg. On May 14th, 2026, a senior U.S. DOJ official leaked plans that sent absolute shockwaves through the diplomatic world. I mean, the Justice Department is preparing to formally indict the 94-year-old former Cuban president, Raúl Castro.
Which is an incredibly aggressive legal maneuver, indicting a former head of state, particularly one who is 94 years old. That's huge.
Yeah, unheard of almost.
But the underlying charge is what makes this so complex. It stems from a specific tragedy that occurred on February 24th, 1996. The shootdown of 2 civilian aircraft operated by Brothers to the Rescue.
Right, and for those of you who might just know the name, but maybe not the specifics, Brothers to the Rescue was this Miami-based humanitarian group. Their mission was highly specific. They flew these small, completely unarmed Cessna aircraft out over the Florida Straits.
Just searching the water.
Yeah, searching for Cuban rafters, people who were desperately fleeing the island on makeshift boats, inner tubes, whatever they could find. And the pilots would radio the coordinates to the U.S. Coast Guard so they could save them.
And, to understand the emotional weight behind this impending indictment, we really have to look at the environment that necessitated Brothers to the Rescue in the first place. The early 1990s in Cuba was an era known as the Special Period.
Right after the Soviet collapse.
Exactly. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba just lost its primary economic benefactor overnight. The resulting economic depression was so severe, so absolute, that people were pushed way beyond the limits of human endurance.
The human stories from the files are just harrowing. I mean, this wasn't people buying tickets on a ferry. The sources detail a specific catalyst for the group in 1990. There was a 15-year-old boy named Gregorio Perez Ricardo. He attempted to cross the Florida Straits on a raft. And he didn't drown. He died of severe dehydration.
It's awful.
It is. When the Coast Guard finally found him, he was curled in a fetal position, literally clinging to this 6-foot makeshift raft. He died minutes after they pulled him from the water.
Just surrounded by millions of gallons of ocean water, dying of thirst at 15.
Yeah.
And the tragic part is his story was the rule, not the exception. The files also detail the survival of Felix Versailles. He was a 26-year-old who spent 5 agonizing days at sea. And he described the sheer visceral terror of the crossing.
What did he say happened out there?
He talked about schools of fish biting at his blistered legs while he dangled in the water. He detailed the psychological collapse that happens out there in the Straits, hallucinating massive ships in the pitch black of night, seeing coastlines that simply didn't exist.
Wow. So you have these volunteer pilots in Miami who are watching this horror unfold, and they just decide to take to the air to stop teenagers from dying of dehydration. And they were incredibly effective. I mean, they are credited with saving over 4,200 lives.
They were heroes to that community.
Absolutely. But as the years went on, their mission began to take on a more overt political dimension. In January 1996, they pushed the boundary. They actually flew into Cuban airspace and dropped leaflets over Havana.
Which is a huge escalation.
Yeah, these were messages of empowerment, excerpts from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
But from the perspective of the Cuban government, this crossed a massive red line. They did not view this as a humanitarian gesture, They viewed it as a blatant violation of their national sovereignty, a provocation.
The threat.
Right, a dangerous act of political subversion. So in response, Havana initiated an intelligence operation dubbed Operation Scorpion. And that was aimed at infiltrating the exile community in Miami to monitor and disrupt the group.
Which brings us to that terrible afternoon on February 24th, 1996. 3 brothers to the rescue Cessnas are in the air over the Straits. The Cuban military scrambles MiG-29 and MiG-23 fighter jets.
Real military hardware against Cessna.
Yeah, and according to the investigation conducted by the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, the Cuban jets, intercepted the Cessnas in international airspace. No warning shots, no radio commands to turn back. They just fired air-to-air missiles and completely obliterated 2 of the unarmed planes.
4 men were killed instantly. Mario de la Peña, Carlos Costa, Pablo Morales, and Armando Alejandre Jr. It was literally a vaporization in midair. Their bodies were never even recovered from the ocean.
It sparked massive international outrage, obviously. But for 3 decades, criminal accountability at the highest levels of the Cuban government was non-existent. There were economic sanctions imposed, there were civil judgments won in U.S. courts, sure, but no criminal indictments for the leadership in Havana. Until now.
And the mechanism the DOJ is using here is really critical to understand, because they aren't just going after the pilots who pushed the button in the MiGs.
Right.
They are utilizing the legal doctrine of command responsibility. They are aiming at the very top of the chain of command. The DOJ is relying on what they consider a smoking gun piece of evidence. It's an audio recording from that day where Raúl Castro, who was then the Minister of the Armed Forces, allegedly issues the direct instruction to the pilots to, quote, knock them down.
Wait, okay, let's unpack this for a second. Because how does the timeline work here? Why wait 30 years to build a case around command responsibility? I mean, indicting a 94-year-old man for a 30-year-old crime feels less like traditional courtroom justice and more like, well, it feels like getting Al Capone on tax evasion.
That's exactly it.
It just looks like the U.S. is using its domestic criminal code as a highly precise tool for international regime change.
What's fascinating here is that is exactly what it is. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, specifically a working group led by U.S. Attorney Jason A. Redding-Quinones, they aren't laboring under the delusion that they are going to drag a 94-year-old former head of state into a Miami courtroom to face a jury.
Right. He's never going to stand trial.
No. This indictment is a strategic pretext. It is the foundational layer of a massive legal architecture.
But a pretext for what, exactly?
By securing a federal indictment against the historical leadership of the Cuban government for murder and aircraft sabotage, the U.S. instantly reclassifies the regime. They are no longer just a difficult sanctioned neighbor. They are internationally wanted fugitives.
Oh, wow.
And to see how the U.S. intends to use this, the sources point us directly to what happened just a few months prior in Venezuela, what analysts are calling the Maduro precedent.
Right, the Venezuelan extraction in January 2026. Break down how that connects to this impending Castro indictment for us.
Well, for years, the U.S. Department of Justice held a federal indictment against Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro for narco-terrorism, and just sat there on the books acting as this looming threat, a piece of legal leverage.
Just waiting.
Yeah. But in January 2026, the U.S. government finally activated that warrant. They launched a highly complex military operation physically extracted Maduro from Caracas, and installed an interim government that was instantly recognized by the U.S.
And that new government allowed U.S. oversight of Venezuelan fuel exports, right?
Exactly. So the federal indictment provided the legal and moral justification for a kinetic military action to remove a foreign leader.
Okay, I see. So the Southern District of Florida is currently attempting to build that exact same legal foundation against Havana. The indictment of Raúl Castro is basically the sword of Damocles hanging over the regime. It signals that the U.S. now considers the Cuban leadership to be a criminal enterprise, subject to apprehension.
That's it, exactly.
But that begs a massive question. Timing.
Mm-hmm.
Why strike now, in the summer of 2026? I mean, why not 10 years ago when the audio recording evidence was just as clear?
Because the geopolitical map of the Western Hemisphere violently shifted in January 2026. The dominoes are falling, and the extraction of Maduro in Venezuela was the primary domino.
Let's talk about that domino effect and the resulting energy collapse.
Mm-hmm.
Because Cuba's survival strategy for the last 60 years has essentially been to attach itself to a larger, wealthier geopolitical benefactor.
Absolutely.
During the Cold War, it was the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, they endured the horrors of the special period that we talked about, but they were eventually saved by Venezuela, specifically Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, who struck this massive structural deal with Havana.
Right, the Oil for Doctors program.
Yeah, Venezuela would provide deeply subsidized crude oil, and in exchange, Cuba would provide thousands of doctors, teachers, and intelligence agents.
And it was an artificial lifeline. Venezuela provided this specific type of subsidized heavy crude oil that kept the Cuban electrical grid functioning. But when the U.S. extracted Maduro in January 2026, that lifeline was severed overnight. The new U.S.-backed interim government in Caracas instantly cut off the flow of subsidized oil to Havana.
The fallout numbers in the reports are just staggering. Because of that sudden cutoff, Cuba is currently operating with a 40% daily energy deficit. Almost half of the country's energy requirements simply cannot be met right now. Major thermoelectric plants, specifically the Felton and Antonio Guterres facilities, are completely offline.
And we really have to unpack what it means for a Cuban thermoelectric plant to go offline. These aren't highly efficient, modern, modular power plants like you might picture.
Okay.
These are massive, obsolete, crumbling pieces of infrastructure, largely built with Soviet-era technology.
Right, so you can't just flip a breaker to turn them back on.
Exactly. These plants operate by burning highly specific grades of heavy, sulfur-rich crude oil to boil water, create steam, and turn turbines. The crude they relied on from Venezuela is thick, it's corrosive, and it requires constant, rigorous maintenance of the boilers and pipes.
Which is hard to do without parts.
Exactly. When the fuel stops flowing, the boilers cool down. When the spare parts run out, which they have, the corrosive nature of the residual fuel literally eats away at the infrastructure. So when Felton and Gutierrez go offline, it's not a temporary pause. It is a structural failure. Restarting them takes weeks, assuming they even have the fuel, which they don't.
The human cost of a 40% national energy deficit is catastrophic. The reports describe routine 12-hour blackouts in Havana, and in the eastern provinces, it's exponentially worse. We were talking about entire days without a single watt of electricity.
Think about the cascading effects of that in a tropical environment. A blackout isn't just about the lights going out. It means the municipal water ROMs fail, so there is no running water.
Right.
It means refrigeration is impossible, leading to the rapid mass spoilage of what little food the population has managed to acquire. It means the agricultural sector shuts down because there's no diesel for tractors or transport trucks to move food from the farms to the cities.
And the most terrifying consequence outlined in the intelligence is the collapse of the public health system. The sources describe it as being in a state of, quote, functional stasis. Hospitals simply cannot operate. Surgeons literally cannot scrub in. Life support machines rely on backup generators, but those generators require diesel, which is also gone.
It's a nightmare.
It is so horrific that over the last 3 years, 70,000 healthcare workers, the very doctors and nurses that the regime used to boast about, have simply fled the country.
They are abandoning their posts because they refuse to watch their patients die from easily preventable causes simply because the power grid failed. It's too much to bear.
But let me push back on the novelty of this for a second, because anyone who has paid attention to Latin America has been hearing about shortages, rolling blackouts, and economic misery in Cuba for decades. So Is this 2026 crisis truly an existential threat to the government, or is this just another difficult phase that the regime will brutally manage, suppress the protests, and somehow survive, just like they survived the 90s?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a critical distinction to make. But if we analyze the underlying mechanics, this is fundamentally different from the 1990s. The 1990s special period was a severe economic contraction, sure, but the state retained its structural integrity. They had a population that, while suffering, still contained a core of ideological fervor.
They still believed in the revolution.
Right. And a leadership that was highly organized.
And today?
Today, the ideological fervor is entirely gone. The population is exhausted, and the state apparatus itself is hollowed out. The state has lost its primary function, the ability to provide basic services and maintain social order. This isn't just a cyclical downturn. It is a systemic collapse.
And crucially, the geopolitical cavalry is not coming over the hill to save them this time.
That is the definitive difference. In the past, Havana could play the geopolitical game. If Washington squeezed, Havana would look to Moscow or Beijing for a bailout, offering them a strategic foothold 90 miles from Florida in exchange for oil and debt forgiveness. But the sources highlight a profound, unprecedented geopolitical isolation in 2026.
Right. Russia is deeply bogged down in its own economic crises and geopolitical overextension, and China is dealing with severe internal economic headwinds. Beijing has absolutely no appetite for throwing billions of dollars of capital into a failing Caribbean state that offers zero financial return on investment.
The diplomatic cables are incredibly revealing here. The Russian ambassador to Cuba explicitly stated that it is Havana's responsibility to solve its own oil crisis.
Wow.
I mean, that is a stunning diplomatic rebuke. It is Moscow publicly hanging up the phone on their oldest ally in the hemisphere.
Okay, so Venezuela is gone, Russia is busy, China isn't interested. But hold on, Cuba is a sovereign nation. Why can't they just go to the open market? Why can't they just buy oil from Mexico, or secure investments from Europe, or strike a deal with a Middle Eastern energy conglomerate? They have ports, they can buy things, right?
And that brings us to the third and perhaps most devastating mechanism of the maximum pressure campaign, the economic vice. The reason Cuba cannot simply buy its way out of this crisis on the open market is because the United States has constructed an invisible, impenetrable financial wall around the island.
You were talking about the May 1st, 2026 executive order. The U.S. president signed an order titled, "Imposing Sanctions on Those Responsible for Repression in Cuba and for Threats to United States National Security and Foreign Policy." The intelligence makes it clear this is not just a routine bureaucratic update to the embargo. This is a massive escalation.
To understand the lethality of this executive order, we really have to clearly differentiate between primary and secondary sanctions. Because for decades, the U.S. embargo on Cuba relied almost exclusively on primary sanctions.
Which means what in practice?
Primary sanctions mean the U.S. government prohibits U.S. citizens, U.S. companies, and U.S. banks from doing business with Cuba. If an agricultural company in Texas tries to sell tractors directly to the Cuban government, the U.S. Treasury Department will fine them. But under primary sanctions, if a company in Spain wants to build a hotel in Havana or a French bank wants to finance it, the U.S. largely couldn't stop them because those European entities operate outside of U.S. jurisdiction.
But secondary sanctions change the rules of the game entirely.
They rewrite the rules of global commerce. Secondary sanctions authorize the U.S. government to penalize foreign persons, foreign corporations, and foreign financial institutions if they engage with targeted sectors of the Cuban economy.
Wow.
And the May 1st executive order specifically targets the Cuban energy, defense, mining, and financial sectors.
So let me make sure I understand the mechanics of this. If a French bank processes a transaction for a Cuban mining company or a Greek shipping line decides to transport oil from the Middle East to Havana, what exactly happens? How does the U.S. punish a French bank?
The U.S. utilizes the sheer dominance of the U.S. dollar. Global trade runs on dollars. If a French bank wants to operate globally, they need correspondent accounts at major U.S. banks in New York to clear those dollar transactions.
Right.
When the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, applies secondary sanctions, they are essentially telling that French bank, because you process a transaction for Cuba, we're cutting you off from the U.S. financial system. Your correspondent accounts in New York are frozen. You can no longer clear U.S. dollars.
So what does this all mean? Which is basically a death sentence for an international bank. So the U.S. is forcing a brutal binary choice on the entire global economy. They're telling every bank, every shipping line, every multinational corporation on Earth, you can have access to the impoverished, high-risk Cuban market, or you can have access to the multi-trillion-dollar U.S. financial system. But you absolutely cannot have both.
It's a financial quarantine. And no rational international bank or corporate board is going to choose the Cuban market over the U.S. market. The compliance departments of these global banks will simply block any transaction that even has the word Cuba in the metadata. It effectively exiles the Cuban state from the global financial plumbing.
But the intelligence sources point out that these secondary sanctions aren't just a blanket punishment on the island. They are highly targeted at a specific entity inside the Cuban power structure, an entity known as GESA.
Right, GESA, Grupo de Administración Empresarial S.A. To the outside observer, it sounds like a mundane, bureaucratic holding company. But in reality, it is the beating heart of the regime's power and wealth.
Break down how GESA actually functions for us, because it's not a private company, right?
No, not at all. It is a vast, opaque conglomerate run entirely by the Cuban military, the Revolutionary Armed Forces, or the FAR. Over the last 3 decades, the military systematically absorbed the most profitable sectors of the Cuban economy. Today, GESA operates as a monopoly capitalist corporation wrapped inside a communist military apparatus.
That's quite the paradox.
It is. They control the tourism industry. They own the luxury hotels, the tour bus companies, the foreign exchange mechanisms. They control the massive retail stores, the vital import-export ports, the gas stations, and the financial institutions that process remittances from Cuban Americans.
And the level of corruption detailed in the sources regarding GESA is just staggering. It completely shatters the myth of egalitarian socialism. Remember how we were just talking about Venezuela supplying Cuba with subsidized oil to keep the power plants running?
Yeah.
Well, the intelligence analysis reveals that between 2024 and 2025, 60% of the oil that Cuba received from Venezuela never actually made it to the Cuban power grid.
It was intercepted by a GESA-linked corporation before it could be used for the public good.
How does a military holding company steal millions of barrels of oil from its own country?
Through a highly sophisticated network of offshore shell companies. The oil tankers from Venezuela would arrive, but instead of offloading the crude to run the Antonio Guterres power plant, GESA operatives would use falsified bills of lading and ship-to-ship transfers.
You're kidding.
No, they would re-export that subsidized oil, selling it on the open spot market to buyers in Asia who didn't care about the origin of the crude.
So while the Cuban people were suffering through 12-hour blackouts, losing their food to spoilage, and watching their hospitals fail, the military elite were taking the oil meant for the nation, selling it for hard currency, and funneling the proceeds into offshore tax havens. The data shows only 40% of the oil ever reached the Cuban people.
It is institutionalized theft on a macroeconomic scale. And the architects of the U.S. maximum pressure campaign understand this dynamic perfectly. By targeting GESA with secondary sanctions, the U.S. is aiming directly at the wallets of the military generals and the regime oligarchs. They are systematically drying up the offshore slush funds that keep the elite loyal to the system.
It's an internal wedge strategy.
Exactly. If the generals can no longer enrich themselves through GESA monopolies, their loyalty to the civilian leadership and the Communist Party becomes highly questionable. The U.S. is engineering a scenario where the military decides that the political leadership is a liability they can no longer afford to protect.
So you have the White House and the Treasury Department strangling the regime from the outside. But the pressure isn't just coming top-down from the government. It is also coming from the bottom up. It is coming from private citizens, corporate boardrooms, and it is being weaponized by the U.S. federal court system. This is what the analysts are calling the privatization of the embargo. Lawfare.
This is perhaps the most legally fascinating and internationally controversial aspect of the entire 2026 campaign. It revolves around a piece of legislation passed back in 1996, the Helms-Burton Act.
Passed, ironically enough, as a direct legislative response to the brothers, to the rescue shootdown we talked about at the beginning. President Bill Clinton signed it into law in March 1996, literally surrounded by the grieving families of the men who were killed by the MiGs.
The Helms-Burton Act was a watershed moment. It codified the U.S. embargo into law, effectively taking the power to lift the embargo away from the president and placing it entirely in the hands of Congress. But the true engine of Helms-Burton is a highly contentious provision known as Title III.
Explain Title III for us. What does it actually do?
Title III allows U.S. nationals to file lawsuits in American federal courts against any company, U.S. or foreign, that traffics in property that was confiscated by the Cuban government during the 1959 revolution.
To understand the scale of that confiscated property, we really have to remember the immediate aftermath of Fidel Castro taking power in 1959. The revolutionary government engaged in a rapid, massive nationalization of virtually all private property on the island. They seized vast sugar mills, cattle ranches, telephone companies, oil refineries, luxury hotels, and thousands of small family businesses.
Anything of value, really.
Yeah. And much of this property belonged to U.S. citizens and U.S. corporations, or to Cubans who subsequently fled to the United States and became naturalized citizens.
And under standard international law, a sovereign government possesses the right of eminent domain. They can expropriate property, but the international legal standard requires them to pay prompt, adequate, and effective compensation to the owners.
Which the Cuban government never did.
They paid absolutely nothing. So Title III was designed to allow those original owners or their heirs to sue anyone who is currently profiting off that stolen property. If a European hotel chain managed a resort built on land stolen from a Cuban-American family in 1960, that family can sue the European hotel chain in a Miami federal court.
But the sources note that for over 20 years, this provision was essentially dormant.
It was considered way too radioactive. Title III was so hated by U.S. allies in Europe, Canada, and Mexico, countries that actively did business in Cuba, that every single U.S. President Clinton, Bush, Obama, they all suspended Title III every 6 months. They utilized a presidential waiver because they deemed it too disruptive to international relations and global trade.
Until Donald Trump. In 2019, the Trump administration broke the precedent. They refused to sign the waiver, they activated Title III, and the legal floodgates burst open. Decades-old historical grievances were instantly transformed into active, multi-million-dollar federal lawsuits. And the intelligence sources highlight two massive, landscape-altering cases currently sitting before the United States Supreme Court in 2026 that could fundamentally shatter the Cuban economy. We're talking about ExxonMobil v. Cemex and Havana Docks Court v. Royal Caribbean Cruises.
Let's look at the mechanics of these cases. The ExxonMobil case is relatively straightforward in its historical origin. In 1960, the Cuban revolutionary government seized massive oil refineries owned by Esso Standard Oil, which is a predecessor to modern-day ExxonMobil.
Right.
Exxon is now utilizing Title III to sue the Cuban state-owned oil corporations, like Cemex and Cupit, for the absolute total value of those refineries, plus over 60 years of interest and statutory trouble damages.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The Havana Docks case is where the legal theory gets wild. Havana Docks Corporation is backed by a man named Miguel Díaz-Canel, who is the heir to the ITT corporate telecommunications empire. Havana Docks is suing major international cruise lines Carnival, Royal Caribbean, Norwegian for hundreds of millions of dollars. The basis of the lawsuit. During the brief period when the Obama administration eased restrictions and allowed cruise travel to Cuba, those ships docked at a specific terminal in Havana, and Havana Docks claims they own the commercial concession to that pier.
And here is the incredible detail. That concession originated in 1904. It was a 99-year lease granted by the Cuban government at the time to build and operate a commercial cargo pier.
Hold on, I need to stop you there. A 99-year lease granted in 1904. That means it legally expired in 2003. How does a lawsuit over an expired 1904 pier concession actually force a geopolitical regime change in 2026? Isn't this just a massive, cynical corporate cash grab by wealthy heirs and multinational oil behemoths?
This raises an important question, actually. On the surface, it definitely looks like a corporate cash grab. But beneath the surface, it is a deliberate assault on the foundational principles of international law, specifically the legal concept of sovereign immunity. This is why these Supreme Court cases are the linchpin of the lawfare strategy.
Define sovereign immunity for us in this context.
Sovereign immunity is a bedrock principle of international relations, which dictates that one sovereign nation cannot be sued in the domestic courts of another nation without its consent. You generally cannot sue the government of France in a federal court in Texas. In the United States, this principle is codified in the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, the FSIA. The FSIA protects foreign governments and their state-owned entities from being dragged into U.S. litigation.
Right, otherwise diplomacy would be impossible if every country was constantly suing every other country in local courts.
Exactly. But in these 2026 Supreme Court cases, the U.S. Solicitor General has filed briefs arguing for a radical reinterpretation. They are arguing that the FSIA is an undue burden when it comes to holding Cuba accountable. They are arguing that because the Cuban government engaged in the unlawful expropriation of property, and because entities like GISA are engaged in commercial trafficking of that property, they have forfeited their sovereign immunity.
If the Supreme Court agrees with that argument and officially strips Cuba's state-owned entities of their sovereign immunity, what is the practical on-the-ground result?
It would be a legal earthquake. Suddenly, a U.S. federal judge could issue a massive multi-billion-dollar default judgment against a Cuban state company like Cemex or GISA. And if that Cuban company does business anywhere in the world that intersects with the U.S. financial system, which, as we discussed with secondary sanctions, is almost everywhere those assets could be seized to pay the judgment.
Wow. It weaponizes the global banking system for debt collection.
It creates a legal minefield so incredibly treacherous that absolutely no foreign company would dare touch the island. Think about it. If a Spanish hotel chain knows that managing a resort in Veradero might result in a billion-dollar judgment against them in a Miami court, and that U.S. authorities could seize the hotel chain's assets in New York to pay that judgment, they will pull out of Cuba immediately. It is the ultimate paralyzing deterrent to foreign investment.
But the sources also delve into a deeply human, deeply emotional layer to this lawfare. It's not just ExxonMobil and cruise lines. It is ordinary Cuban exiles. Families who lost literally everything they had built over generations. The files detail the story of the Valdez-Fowley family. They owned the Pedroso Bank in Havana. In November 1960, an agent of the revolution walked into their bank carrying a machine gun, called the family Gusanos worms, and ordered them out of the building.
Just horrifying.
They weren't even allowed to take the family photographs off the walls.
Yeah.
Decades of generational wealth and legacy just erased at gunpoint in an afternoon.
For families like the Valdez-Fowleys, Title III represents a theoretical, albeit delayed, path to justice that they have waited over 60 years for. It is validation of their loss. But their profound fear, as detailed in the intelligence analyses, is that they're going to be betrayed at the finish line by the very U.S. government that encouraged them to file these lawsuits.
Yes, the sources explicitly mention their fear of a Venezuela-style backroom deal. Unpack what they mean by that.
Well, the exiles worry that if this maximum pressure campaign actually works, if the energy grid completely fails and the regime begins to fatally fracture, the U.S. government will suddenly prioritize global macroeconomic stability and corporate business interests over the localized justice sought by the Miami exiles.
They fear a pragmatic compromise.
Precisely. They fear the U.S. State Department will quietly negotiate a transition with the more pragmatic, surviving elements of the Cuban military. The U.S. might offer amnesty to the corrupt officials in exchange for stability and tell the exile families, look, we have to write off those old 1960 property claims, we need to stabilize this new transitional government, and we need to clear the legal hurdles so Exxon can safely go back in and drill for oil without worrying about your lawsuits.
Man, it is a brutal calculation. The geopolitical necessity of stabilizing a post-collapse Cuba, preventing a failed state 90 miles from Florida, might directly, unavoidably conflict with the moral imperative of restorative justice for the victims of the 1959 confiscations.
Which brings us perfectly to the mechanism the U.S. is using to try and orchestrate that exact transition. Because the U.S. isn't just turning the screws blindly, hoping for a chaotic collapse. They have opened a very specific, very narrow diplomatic exit door for the regime. But the toll to walk through that door is staggering.
The ultimatum. Let's set the stage for this. We have established the immense pressure matrix. The DOJ is threatening to publicly indict the supreme historical leader for murder. The national energy grid has collapsed because the Venezuelan oil pipeline was severed. Secondary sanctions are systematically isolating and bankrupting the military's financial holding company. And the Supreme Court is poised to legally weaponize private lawsuits to terrify any remaining foreign investors.
The country is completely paralyzed.
Completely. And in the absolute epicenter of this paralysis, on May 14th, 2026, the exact same day the DOJ indictment plans against Raúl Castro were leaked to the press, a highly classified secret meeting took place in Havana. CIA Director John Ratcliffe flew to the island.
Just pause on that for a second. Having the director of the Central Intelligence Agency conduct an on-the-ground diplomatic mission in Havana is highly, highly unusual. This wasn't a standard State Department envoy. It signals the extreme terminal gravity of the moment. Ratcliffe wasn't there to negotiate trade tariffs or arrange a photo op. He was there as an emissary of the president to deliver a stark, final message.
And who he met with is arguably just as important as the message itself. He didn't meet with the official figurehead president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. He met with a man named Raúl Guillermo Rodriguez Castro.
Known universally in the Cuban power structure as Raulito.
Raulito. He is the grandson of Raúl Castro. He is the son of the late Luis Alberto López Callejas, the man who historically ran GSA and built its financial empire. Raulito is a central figure in the regime's elite security apparatus. He essentially represents the intersection of the historical bloodline, the offshore money, and the guns.
The U.S. intelligence apparatus views Raulito as the prime representative of the next generation of the elite. The calculation is that this younger generation is perhaps less bound by the rigid, archaic, ideological dogma of the 1959 revolution.
They're more practical.
Yeah, they are businessmen with guns. They are interested in pragmatic survival, wealth preservation, and maintaining their status. The CIA is betting that this younger generation might be willing to trade absolute political power for personal amnesty and financial survival.
The sources outline the exact ultimatum Ratcliffe delivered across the table. It was the classic carrot and a massive stick. The carrot was a $100 million immediate humanitarian aid package. Food, medicine, and critical logistical support to alleviate the starvation and the blackouts that are ravaging the population. But the condition for that aid, the stick, was what the U.S. diplomatically terms fundamental changes.
And we need to translate that. Fundamental changes is diplomatic code for regime transition. The U.S. demanded 3 specific things: the immediate, verifiable release of all political prisoners, a total opening of the economy to free market private enterprise principles, and, most crucially, a structural transition of power away from the total constitutional dominance of the Communist Party.
And Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel, who was bypassed for this meeting, entirely responded publicly to the pressure campaign on social media. He tweeted that Cuba would theoretically accept humanitarian aid if it was delivered in accordance with standard international practices, without what he called obstacles or ingratitude. But he pointed out the bitter, glaring paradox of the U.S. offer. He argued that the suffering of the Cuban people is deliberately induced by the tightening U.S. blockade, and that if the U.S. truly wanted to alleviate the humanitarian crisis, they should just lift the sanctions rather than offering aid with a gun to their head.
It is the standard, decades-old rhetorical defense of the regime. They frame all internal economic failure and human suffering as the exclusive, unavoidable result of external imperialist aggression. But the reality on the ground in 2026 makes that rhetoric increasingly hollow to a population that is starving in the dark while the elite siphon off the remaining resources.
But Díaz-Canel is right about the surreal, almost schizophrenic nature of the U.S. strategy here. I mean, offering a $100 million humanitarian lifeline with your left hand while simultaneously using secondary banking sanctions to starve the national energy grid with your right hand. The intelligence sources refer to this dual approach as attempting a friendly takeover.
The friendly takeover concept is a fascinating piece of geopolitical engineering. It relies entirely on understanding the internal fragmentation within the Cuban power structure. We talked earlier about GSA, the corrupt oligarchs hoarding the wealth in offshore accounts, but U.S. analysts explicitly differentiate the top-tier GSA's elite from the rank and file of the Revolutionary Armed Forces, the FAR.
Why does that distinction matter to the CIA? I mean, why does the U.S. care about the difference between a GSA executive and a FAR colonel?
Because the FAR, the traditional military institution, possesses a deep sense of national pride and, most importantly, a monopoly on organized force. While the top generals might be deeply correct and intertwined with GSA, the mid-level officers, the captains, the lieutenants, and the rank-and-file soldiers are suffering through the exact same 12-hour blackouts and food shortages as the civilian population. They resent the GSA oligarchs who are living in luxury while the country burns.
So the U.S. is actively trying to drive a wedge between the institutional military and the political financial leadership.
Exactly. The ultimatum delivered to Raulito, combined with the looming threat of the Raúl Castro indictment, is a highly calibrated signal. The U.S. is saying the top layer, the Castro family, the corrupt GSA billionaires, the entrenched Communist Party leadership, they must go. Their time is over. But if the institutional military, the FAR, steps in to facilitate a peaceful transition to a democratic system, they might survive the collapse intact.
Wait, the U.S. wants to keep the Cuban military intact after a regime collapse. Doesn't that risk them just taking over as a military junta?
It's a calculated risk, for sure, but a necessary one from Washington's perspective. The U.S. desperately wants to avoid a total anarchic collapse of order. If the state completely dissolves, it could lead to a bloody civil war or a mass migration crisis, where hundreds of thousands of desperate people throw themselves into the Florida Straits, dwarfing the crises of the 90s. The U.S. needs a functional, disciplined security force to manage the transition, maintain order, and distribute aid. But they need a military that answers to a newly formed civilian democratic government, not a communist Politburo.
And there is a much broader global geopolitical requirement attached to this friendly takeover scenario. The U.S. demands that Cuba permanently cease to be a safe haven for extra-hemispheric adversaries. They are explicitly demanding that Havana evict Russian intelligence operations, shut down listening posts, and remove Chinese economic and surveillance influence from the island.
It is the enforcement of a modern, aggressive interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. is utilizing this moment of extreme vulnerability to permanently reshape the security architecture of the Caribbean. They want a compliant, stable neighbor that is deeply integrated into the North American economic sphere. They will no longer tolerate a forward operating base for Moscow or Beijing 90 miles from their shores.
And while the U.S. is projecting all of this maximum pressure 90 miles to the south, utilizing all these levers of national power, the intelligence sources reveal they're also aggressively, ruthlessly cleaning house right here at home.
Yes, the conflict isn't just happening in the hotels of Havana or the power grids of the eastern provinces. It is happening in the federal courtrooms and intelligence corridors of Washington and Miami.
Let's look at the counterintelligence sweep. The Department of Justice recently filed a civil denaturalization complaint against a man named Victor Manuel Rocha. Now, Rocha is not a low-level operative. He is a former U.S. ambassador. He has degrees from Harvard and Georgetown. He served at the absolute highest levels of the U.S. State Department, with critical postings throughout Latin America and even a stint on the National Security Council at the White House.
And in April 2024, the facade completely crumbled. He stood in a federal court and admitted that he had been secretly serving as a covert agent for Cuba's intelligence services, the G2, since 1973.
Since 1973. For over 40 years, through the Cold War, through multiple administrations, one of America's top diplomats in Latin America, a man shaping U.S. foreign policy, was an active mole for Fidel Castro.
It is the ultimate catastrophic betrayal of trust. The damage to U.S. national security is almost incalculable. He had access to the most sensitive intelligence assessments regarding U.S. strategy in the region. He actually bragged to an undercover FBI agent who he thought was a Cuban handler that his life's work for Cuba was a grand slam against the U.S. enemy.
He's currently serving a 15-year prison sentence.
Yeah.
But the DOJ, under this new maximum pressure posture, isn't stopping there. The civil denaturalization complaint is a targeted effort to permanently strip Rocha of his United States citizenship.
Denaturalization is an incredibly rare and severe legal maneuver. It is historically reserved for the most extreme cases, like individuals who concealed their involvement in Nazi war crimes or international terrorism to gain entry to the U.S.
U.S. Attorney Quiñones stated publicly that this move is about finishing the job. The DOJ argues that Rocha obtained his citizenship through profound lies and betrayal. He stood in a room, swore a sacred oath of allegiance to the U.S. Constitution, while actively, secretly working for decades to subvert it on behalf of a hostile foreign power. They are arguing that he should not retain the ultimate privilege of being an American citizen, even while sitting in a federal prison cell.
And the intelligence indicates that Rocha is just the tip of the spear. This is not an isolated prosecution. It is part of a much broader systemic Justice Department initiative. They are actively moving to denaturalize a dozen individuals for concealing ties to espionage, terrorist support, and war crimes.
What does this aggressive, highly publicized counterintelligence sweep tell us about the broader U.S. strategy? How does stripping an old man of his citizenship in prison help topple the regime in Havana?
It reveals a fundamental shift in how the U.S. national security apparatus views the Cuban threat. The U.S. intelligence community is deeply institutionally traumatized by the Rocha case. To have a mole operating with impunity at the ambassadorial level for 40 years is a catastrophic failure of counterintelligence. It has led to a scorched earth policy against any and all Cuban operatives within U.S. borders.
So they aren't treating Cuba like a harmless, failing state anymore.
Exactly. For years, there was a dismissive attitude in some Washington circles that Cuba was just an impoverished relic, a rusting annoyance. The Rocha case and the subsequent DOJ crackdown proves that the U.S. government now views the Cuban intelligence apparatus, the G2, as a highly sophisticated, highly capable, and deeply embedded national security threat. The economic sanctions we discussed are designed to starve the Cuban state from the outside. But this counterintelligence sweep is designed to blind its spies and violently sever its tentacles from the inside of the U.S. government.
They are blinding the regime before the final collapse.
They are ensuring that as the internal pressure reaches a breaking point in Havana, the regime cannot rely on its embedded agents in Washington to warn them of U.S. maneuvers or manipulate U.S. policy to save them.
Which brings us to the end of this incredible multi-layered journey. We have covered a massive amount of geopolitical ground today. To you, our listener, I hope this deep dive has illuminated the sheer, daunting complexity of what is happening right now, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
It is a textbook historical example of how statecraft, lawfare, and hybrid warfare have evolved in the 21st century.
This deep dive really reveals that modern regime change isn't just fought with tanks rolling across a border or troops storming a presidential palace. It is fought with engineered energy blockades that plunge millions into darkness by cutting off the specific crude oil their aging infrastructure needs. It is fought on the pristine dockets of the Supreme Court, litigating century-old peer leases to strip sovereign immunity. It is fought with secondary banking sanctions that terrify global financial clearinghouses in New York, and it is fought with highly targeted, politically timed indictments for decades-old aerial tragedies. It is a terrifying masterclass in hybrid maximum pressure strategy.
Every single lever of national power, economic, diplomatic, judicial, and clandestine, is being pulled simultaneously with absolute precision to force a structural collapse.
But as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something that isn't neatly resolved in the intelligence reports or the DOJ press releases, but is the undeniable looming elephant in the room. Let's assume the U.S. strategy works perfectly. Let's assume the energy grid fails completely, the military splinters, Rolito accepts the ultimatum, the Castro family boards a plane into exile, and the 60-year-old regime officially falls by the end of the summer of 2026.
The ultimate theoretical success of the maximum pressure campaign.
Right. What happens the day after? If this friendly takeover succeeds, who actually inherits the ruins of a country that has been hollowed out by a 60-year embargo, systemic institutional corruption, and a sudden, catastrophic energy collapse?
It is the billion-dollar question that no one seems fully prepared to answer. Does the country belong to the Cuban people on the island? The people who have endured decades of starvation, blackouts, and repression, who are now hoping to build a fragile, functioning democracy from the rubble?
Or does it belong to the returning exiles in Miami? Families armed with Supreme Court judgments and Title III lawsuits, demanding the legal return of their stolen banks, their ancestral homes, and their sugar mills.
Or, perhaps most cynically, does the island simply become a massive, deregulated frontier for multinational U.S. corporations? The Exxons, the cruise lines, the massive hotel conglomerates, the entities that have been waiting patiently in the wings for 60 years, armed with capital, ready to buy up the pristine coastlines and infrastructure for pennies on the dollar.
Who inherits the ashes? It is a question that the grand juries, the executive orders, and the CIA ultimatums haven't answered yet. And it is something for you to deeply ponder as history unfolds right now, just 90 miles from our shores. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep reading, keep questioning the invisible forces shaping our world, and we'll see you next time.